All right, good evening. Thank you for joining us for a second episode of This Is What Democracy Looks Like, put out by Stronger NC. I'm Crystal Rand, I'll be your host tonight, and with me is Senator Jeff Jackson.
Hey, Stronger NC. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
So,
what do you want to talk about, Crystal?
Anything. We want to talk about your family.
People might be interested in.
They might be interested in that. And we know gerrymandering was one of the first bills that you put through.
Very first bill I ever filed.
So I know this is dear to your heart, so I thought we would talk a little bit about gerrymandering,
okay,
the history of it, and what's next.
Okay.
And I mean recent history. So just to kind of level set for everybody, you want to talk for just a second about what is gerrymandering?
Sure. And we've already talked about it, so I'm going to talk to them. This is okay. So gerrymandering is basically the situation where you get to redraw all the districts in the state, and if you have the power to do that, you can draw the districts heavily to your advantage. So every 10 years we do a census nationally, and then we use that data to redraw the districts because we all move and we need to make sure that we're all still representing the same number of people. So in North Carolina, you've got 50 state senators. We each represent about 200,000 people. So over 10 years, as people move, you need to make sure that we all still represent 200,000 people. So it's a pretty innocuous process, or it should be in theory, but because of all the data that we have on voters, we've turned this into a system where we can basically draw the districts to make sure people are going to win and other people are going to lose. We can control the outcomes of elections for the next decade all across the state, really until the next round of redistricting. My party did this for years, and then we lost the power to do it in 2010 when the Republicans came in. And now the Republicans, they took our art to a science, and they put the pedal to the metal on just how rigged the entire state can be.
Right. So one of the things that we hear kind of two different stories. One is gerrymandering's gone on for decades, if not longer. This is an old story. There's nothing new about it. On the other side, we kind of hear, well, why has it been so crazy? Why have we talked so much about it in the past couple of years? And I think one of those points where maybe it shifted was with that Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013. Would you agree that was sort of a tipping point? Or?
Well, that was a very bad case for us because North Carolina was under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which meant that any time we tried to do anything involving voter rights, the federal government had to pre-clear that decision because we were one of a number of states that had a history of suppressing the vote and doing that along racial lines. So when Section 5 went out the window, the week after that happened, they filed the monster voter suppression bill that suppressed the vote in about 10 different ways. All of which, coincidentally, happened to hurt one party more than the other.
Right.
So that, I would say that was directly related. That voter suppression bill was directly related to the Shelby case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So part of what we see from that is, originally, I think it was 9 states, a couple hundred counties had to have this pre-clearance, right? So if they redrew the districts, they had to get the Supreme Court to clear it. And so that court case pretty much ended it, right?
Right.
SCOTUS said it's not fair that some states need to have this pre-clearance and some don't. And so that's what opened it up.
Well, they thought we had made enough progress societally that we would no longer be tempted to abuse the privilege, the right to vote, in such a grotesque way. And they were immediately proven wrong about that.
And so I was actually reading, I think it was within 2 days, we started seeing announcements from a handful of states that redistricting was underway as soon as that was kind of taken off the table.
Well, right, that was the voter suppression piece, yeah.
Okay. So in the past, let's say over the past 30 days, we've had some really good news out of the Supreme Court.
Agreed.
And so I want to talk a little bit about some of those because it's been both for the federal level and for the NCGA. What do you think has been maybe the most important one recently?
Well, both of the 2 rulings that we've had from the Supreme Court have basically enshrined the same principle, which is you can't allow race to be the dominant feature of a district when you draw the district. Because what the General Assembly said when they redrew the districts was, we're going to draw all the African American districts first, and each one of those districts is going to have at least 50% African American registered vote. And that's going to be the dominant feature of that district, is the number of African Americans there. And the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't create a strict racial quota as your overriding factor without an incredibly compelling reason, which they didn't have.
Right.
So now we're going to, what they've basically done is ring fence all the African American communities throughout the entire state. I mean, when you look at gerrymandering, that's why the districts look so crazy, because they basically just ring fenced where all the African Americans live. So what they're going to have to do now is unpack a lot of those districts. Not to a huge extent, but to a significant extent. Significant enough that it could have a really major impact on the next round of elections. It's not the end-all be-all solution for gerrymandering by any stretch.
Right.
We still have to get to an independent commission that draws these districts.
Okay. So, and both these rulings were around the 2011 redistricting.
That's right.
That's right. So since then, we've actually had another redistricting.
That's right.
And is that any different?
We had that redistricting. It was we have 13 congressional districts. They are all drawn by the General Assembly here. And so all of those districts were redrawn for the same reason, because they found that the African American districts were a unconstitutional racial gerrymander. So those districts have already been redrawn. So they are probably not going to have to be redrawn again.
Okay.
So the same ruling that applied to those districts has now been applied to the state legislature, and that's why we're having to redraw ours.
So if they were to, let's say we're going to redraw the district again, do you think it's going to be different? Or are we going to have the same people redraw them?
Yep, same people.
Consultants?
Yep, same consultants, the same motivation.
Right.
They're still going to see how many Republicans they can fit in the General Assembly, because they told us they were going to do that. When they had to redraw the congressional maps, the split was 10-3 with 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, and the guy in charge of redrawing on the House said, I'm going to make it 10-3 because I can't find a way to make it 11-2.
Yeah, I recall that.
So they're very blatant
shocking
about the corruption behind this, because that's what it is. It is simple political corruption. But it is going to make a big difference that they have to redraw these districts, even assuming that they minimally comply with the court order and really drag their feet, because every time you unpack one of these districts, it creates more competitive districts in all the adjacent districts.
Exactly.
So it's going to get us at least one step closer towards political moderation. And our true political selves as a state. We're a 50-50 state. We shouldn't have 2 supermajorities running the General Assembly. That's not how we vote as a state. It's just not our voice.
Right. And so I think that's something that's really frustrating to voters, as we go and, kind of, we put our votes in, we want certain people elected, and then I think it's creating a perception that my vote doesn't count.
Yeah.
And we're seeing lower voter turnout for it too.
And that perception is real in a lot of parts of the state. As a 50-50 state, we should be a national example in how 50-50 can actually work, how it can function. It would be wonderful. There aren't too many functioning models of 50-50 right now in our country. Right. There's no reason North Carolina can't be that.
Mm-hmm. So, another question I had for you was, and I think you were there for this last night, there was Common Cause put together a hearing on HB 200 and Senate Bill 209.
Yeah.
Those have not even gone to committee yet.
Right.
And so Common Cause came together with a few other groups and said, well, let's let the people hear them. What were your impressions from just being there last night?
Well, first of all, there were 3 times as many people there as I thought. I mean, it was a great, for a Monday afternoon, to get 250 people in a windowless conference room in the General Assembly, citizens from all across the state, is remarkable. On an issue like gerrymandering, right. Not one of these issues that we all know, like teacher pay or HB2, but on kind of a technical, wonky issue, to have that many people come in and care. People signed up to speak 2 straight hours of people speaking in 2-minute increments about why we need to have independent redistricting, why we need to stop political gerrymandering. For me, it was really encouraging that finally this has reached a level of awareness that this group of people thought it was important enough to come together.
Yeah, it's not the weird word you heard in 9th grade civics and then forgot about.
Right.
Now people really understand gerrymandering and how serious it is to all the other issues in the state as well.
Right now it is the root of all political evil in North Carolina. It's worse than money in politics, and money in politics is really bad. This is worse than that.
That is a powerful statement.
Yeah.
I know that most of our representatives were invited to that event. You and just a couple others showed up. What do you think the impact of that sort of event is on your colleagues?
I think it reinforces that there is no defense for gerrymandering. I have yet to hear anybody explain to me why the system that we have is appropriate or ethical. It is literally indefensible, and that I've never heard anybody say, no, this is, politicians should be able to draw districts to make sure that they and their buddies never lose. I've never heard anyone make the case to me. And I think in private, every single member of the General Assembly agrees with that. And I know that a lot of the leadership agrees because they filed bills to end gerrymandering back when they were in the minority, and my side threw all those bills in the trash can because we never thought we'd be out of power.
Right.
We really took the low road on this issue for a long time, and boy, did we ever pay for it.
I think we have a viewer question, do you?
Yes, we do. Eilette says, the current district's maps were drawn behind closed doors. How can we ensure a transparent process for redistricting with a meaningful opportunity for public participation?
That's a great question. So when they are ordered to redraw the new districts, they're going to do a huge dog and pony show, just like they did for the last redraw of the congressional districts. And they're going to spread out across the state, and they're going to have public forums where you're allowed to comment. What you need to know is, I bet you anything all those new districts are already drawn. I bet you they've been drawn for months. So what we have to fight for is a completely different method of drawing the districts than we have right now. We have to get all of our legislators on record that they support independent redistricting. And if you ask them about it, it's going to be pretty hard for them to say that they don't, because it's really indefensible what's happening right now. So I encourage everybody to specifically ask your legislator about this, because more and more they're going to have to admit to you that what's happening is completely unacceptable.
And so you talked about, fighting for that ability to do it differently. How do we do that when some of these bills don't even go to committee?
Well, the first thing that you have to do, as I said, is talk to your legislators specifically before they're legislators, ideally when they're candidates. So when we have people running for office and you have the ability to ask them questions, that needs to be the first question. And you need to get a clear yes or no answer on, do you support independent redistricting? Right. Because if the answer isn't yes, that's like asking somebody, do you support bank robbery? If they can't say no to that, then there's an issue there. Right. Then they're planning on getting a cut of the proceeds from the bank robbery.
And so this is a really interesting topic, and I think there's been a little bit more discussion recently around how do you ensure that with the candidates? Because we do think this is going to have to become a voting issue. We can't just rely on the courts to help us. We can't just rely on the current legislature to help us. We need to push it into, it has to be one of the top platform commitments for each of these candidates. Do you have any suggestions for ways we might do that with the pool coming out either for 2017 or 2018 more likely elections?
Well, with the new districts, we're going to have a big boost in the number of competitive districts that we have. Right now, only about 10% of our districts are competitive. So to put that another way, 90% of us basically can't lose a general election right now, which is unreal. And
Job security.
Yeah, which you shouldn't. You shouldn't ever have an elected office that you think you cannot lose, especially not 90% of us. I mean, my goodness. Yeah. So I think that number is going to drop significantly with the redraw. We're going to have a lot more competitive districts. And when you have a competitive district, that means that theoretically you have candidates who are working really hard to get votes from both sides.
Absolutely.
That's going to be the moment in which you can lock them down on the issue of gerrymandering. If you want our votes as independents or unaffiliated or as moderate Democrats or moderate Republicans, you need to be clear on that issue. And it's a bipartisan issue. I mean, even among Republicans who have the majority, there's overwhelming support statewide among just registered Republicans for ending gerrymandering.
Yeah, I think it was HB 200 has something like 39 sponsors, and about close to half are Republican.
And to the credit of a lot of Republicans here, they know that it's probably to their overall political detriment. I mean, they stand to lose seats if we draw districts fairly. Yeah. And yet a lot of Republicans here are still willing to do that because they're so certain that it's the right thing to do. And they're absolutely right.
How do we get to some of those representatives, and how do we let them know that we really support what they're doing? Because I think that's the kind of courage that we really need right now. So how can we best support folks who are in power but maybe aren't towing the party line?
Well, you got Representative Chuck McGrady, and he was one of the leads on that HB 200. He has been fantastic on this issue and taken a lot of flack from his own party for it. And John Hardister out of Greensboro, Republican, wrote an editorial about, hey, we campaigned on this issue when we were in the minority. We are ethically obliged now to be consistent.
That's one of the things I thought was really moving about the event last night on gerrymandering was there were independents, there were Republicans, there were a lot of unaffiliated voters, Democrats, and it was really interesting how many people were saying a variation on the same theme. And I thought, if you can get 250 citizens into a room and they all agree on something.
I know, it was great. These days, right?
Right. I mean, it was kind of a magical moment in a way. And then you think, well, if people can come to that sort of understanding, and this is not their full-time job, it may not be their educational background, how can they do it and the Senate and the House can't?
And that's my pitch to Republican leadership on this. I say, look, you need to succeed where my party failed. My party had the power to end this, and we chose not to for selfish reasons. Now you have the power to end this. Do it. Let your legacy be that you finally fixed this really broken piece of our system, and everyone here, everyone in the state will applaud you for it. And we will all recognize that as something wonderful that you did for the history of this state.
Right. I think maybe the last thing I'll say about the event last night, and I want to get your thoughts on what happens in terms of activist groups, what happens outside of the legislature. If, for example, we can't get those bills into committee and then they never go to a floor vote, I think what you saw last night was people saying, if we're not going to be heard, we're going to make sure that we're heard elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's, honestly, it's a little alarming to me. I think it was a great event and I'm glad it went on, but in other times in our past when our representatives have not listened or represented, we ended up with things like the American Revolution. Well, so I get a little concerned about these things.
Yeah, I think there's some intermediary steps between the bill being heard in committee and taking up arms. So I think the next election, which will probably be in 2018, is going to be a pretty good intermediary step. And this is kind of tricky because the idea of an independent commission and ending gerrymandering is a fundamentally nonpartisan idea.
Yes.
And it's a nonpartisan goal. And like you said, Republicans, independents, unaffiliated, we're all on the same page with getting there. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that there's a nonpartisan means to that nonpartisan end. There are some seats that just need to get flipped if this is going to become a reality, if these bills are going to ever be heard in committee. There are some people who need to go, and there are some great citizens who need to be elected. And hopefully some people watching are interested in running for office. That would be wonderful.
Is there any other way around the current gatekeepers, so to speak? So, for example, if the House Speaker won't let something go to committee, is there any other method around it? Could you propose a bill that would create some sort of, if we had a majority, it would go to committee? Anything like that being discussed? The trouble with that is you could absolutely propose that bill, and that bill would go to the exact same trash can that the gerrymandering bill goes to. So because they just don't have to vote on any bill that they don't want to. Putting aside the fact that they have the votes to say no to any bill, they don't even have to vote on anything. There is a method of dislodging a bill from committee, of forcing it to be dislodged, but you need so many votes for it that as long as they have supermajorities in both chambers, that's really not an effective means. Right. This is going to be a ballot box solution. Mm-hmm. We just need to have the gap closed a little because you have to create this precious political moment where no one's really sure who's going to be in charge for the next round of redistricting. Right.
So then both sides have an incentive to finally come together and bury the weapon. And those moments don't come around too often. Usually one side, like my side, is very confident that we will be in charge for the next round.
Right.
Right until you're not.
So it sounds like we've really, most people are in agreement that it's going to take, this has got to come to the ballot, right?
Yep.
This has to become a voter issue.
Yep.
And once we're able to break a supermajority, then there's the potential for these bills to at least be heard, right,
Agreed.
and considered.
Yeah.
Is that the path that you see forward?
That's the path. As long as there's, again, I don't want to sound too partisan because this is not a partisan ideal, but as long as there are 2 GOP supermajorities, this legislation is not going to move. It just is not.
What would you say is the single most important thing that voters can do to support you, to make sure that these issues are known? What can we do?
Find a group that you're comfortable participating in. These groups are springing up all over the place now. I think it's great. It doesn't have to be affiliated with any particular party or any particular organization. They're just backyard political groups that are springing up, and I think that's wonderful. I think it's part of this new broad movement that has sprung up since There was a political event that happened last year around November. I think it might have something to do with all of this.
Triggered some involvement.
Right? I don't know how closely you follow politics, but there was an election. And I think what's uniting all of these groups and getting all of these people off the sidelines is this sense of basic decency and basic reasonability, and that's wonderful. When that is the motivating factor, it leads to a very big ship. And I think we've got a lot of people on this ship right now. So find an organization that appeals to you, that speaks to your method of activity, and your maybe have some friends join with you, because then you'll stay.
And that's why we're trying to do this show too, is to just kind of open it up to a broader set of audiences, rotating host, bring in different communities.
It's great.
Talk to bipartisan leadership, because we do want to have these conversations at the community level and start them, especially the difficult ones, with kindness and courage, and how do we open that dialogue? And
not everyone's going to go to a precinct meeting for their local party, and that's fine. Some people, this is how they want to participate. This is how they want to learn and engage, and I think that's fantastic. But everyone needs to know, at least have the little box in the back of their head reminding them that next year, if you really want to make a difference, you have to be making phone calls or knocking on doors. Okay. So you've got a year to mentally prepare yourself to know that if that's something, if you really feel like making a difference, there simply is no substitute for making phone calls and knocking on doors. That is in all of our futures. You have to tell people, here's why you need to get off the couch and go vote in an off-year election. Because a lot of people don't vote in off-year elections.
That's right.
But the stakes are so high in North Carolina. The GOP supermajorities are very thin. There are 3 seats in the House and 6 seats in the Senate. And now with the redistricting that we've got coming in, they're in even more danger. If we can break either one of those, we unlock Governor Cooper's veto, and that veto will reshape the political landscape in North Carolina.
Getting us back to that checks and balances, which is, I think, where we're really
We need some. Yeah. We don't have any. We don't have any.
So, well, speaking of conversations, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
This conversation. We'll have a little bit more information on the site afterwards, some links that you can go to. There's a fun game out there called the redistrictinggame.org. You can gerrymander your own district. But I think it will give you an appreciation for the difficulty and what goes into redistricting. So I'd encourage everybody to check that out. And of course, follow Stronger NC. And thank you very much, Senator, for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you soon. Take care, Facebook.